Into the first conference preview show of the 2022 season. We did these last year and we're back. You know, Mike and I kicked off a show a week ago and posted that it was sort of our coming out party for the new year. We're finished all of our preseason content, at least we think we do. We think we are. That preseason fantasy draft guide that is available now on the site is an evolving document. We work on that throughout the summer. Mike and I are going to talk about that on the show. We looked at biggest questions from every team. We went conference by conference. It was a new addition to the preseason fantasy guide. And so far, a lot of great feedback in regards to that addition. There's a lot more player rankings, defensive teams, defense special teams streaming, draft day cheat sheets, impact freshmen, everything that you need for your drafts. We've got it. And we just updated the draft guide again this past week by adding our 2022 projected depth charts for each team. Mike did a great job with that. Took a look at the two deeps with every team. And with that, I'm gonna welcome Mike in. So Mike, welcome in, man. We're gonna look at the AAC today. We're gonna go conference by conference, team by team. Some's gonna involve a little bit more than others, right? But we're gonna get through all the teams, maybe a short tidbit here or there, and some teams we may need to kind of spend a few minutes on. And this is where it gets fun for us a little bit. We'll go back and forth. We're going to agree probably on a ton, but there's going to be some where you and I have had some discussions over the last couple of months. We see a little differently, and it's kind of unique to have two perspectives. And so we're going to do that and cover the AAC today.
Yeah, absolutely. Fun conference to cover. I mean, there's some bottom feeders, but some of the big boys at the top are, challenging for the college football playoff, like we saw last year with Cincinnati. So it's really a fun conference, both just watching college football and then for obviously college fantasy.
Well, this has always been a conference that's been beating the drum of being included with the big boys, right? And we saw Cincinnati get the spot into the playoff last year. Central Florida was beating that drum a few years back. And so we'll start off there because there's a very intriguing situation developing at quarterback over there with Central Florida, with John Rhys Plumlee transferring over to UCF after playing wide receiver at Ole Miss. That whole transition that he went through over there. That was one of our questions for UCF coming out of spring, going into the summer, going into the preseason, right? Or going into the 2022 season is, what are they going to do at quarterback? Do you see John Rhys Plumlee as sort of the favorite there? You expect him to open up as the starter?
I see him as the favorite. I'm starting to be a little bit more hesitant about him opening up as the starter. I think he's the best talent on the team, right? I know I read the preseason magazines more than you do, and at least one of them I've seen does have Mikey Keene as the starter, which is not shocking. He's got a year in the system at this point. His numbers are actually better, like taking a second look, than I initially thought. I think it's just the fact that he's so physically uninspiring. I mean, I'm physically uninspiring, but I don't mean to call a college athlete that, but he's slender and he's 5'11", maybe 5'10", doesn't run the ball very much. So, he's not really exciting from that standpoint, but his numbers as a true freshman were as good as Mackenzie Milton's were when he was a freshman. So, I mean, it's not a bad base to work with. I just think this offense under Gus Malzahn kind of takes off with a running quarterback, and that's who we hope, especially with me ranking him as my QB 10, that's who I hope John Rhys Plumlee is. I think the easy comparison is Nick Marshall back in 2014 under Gus Malzahn, similar running style quarterback. And I was just looking at Nick Marshall's game logs back then, and it's I think 10 of 13 games he rushed for double-digit carries. You give John Rhys Plumlee that type of workload in a defense, in a conference like the AAC, you think should come near 1,000 yards, or at least close to that. If he gets that sort of workload. So, it's one of those situations. I have him QB 10 right now. Going to keep tabs during the summer to see if there's I think Keene might have a slight edge right now. We're more just projecting at this point. But I definitely want to see what transpires in the summer, because I'll have to drop him down slightly if we hear that maybe Keene is going to start that first initial game.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is the biggest dilemma that we face sometimes getting out the preseason content because and John Rice Plumlee has obviously been the topic of discussion we've had. We go into pretty good depth when we're talking about projections because we do have to project a QB1 right now. Much like you mentioned, with yourself reading some of the preseason publications, I do not like reading as much because I want as little influence on my thought process as possible. But I do like to read them after I'm through with the process, just to kind of see where my thoughts land versus some of the others or beat writers that are covering some of the teams, right? And so I have more of my mindset is a little bit more that I want to project the guy that I think is going to be starting come games 2, 3, 4, and 5, not necessarily who might open as the starter, right? So I think you're right, and I think the biggest question for UCF, and we're probably spending more time on this than we will with some of the other teams, because when you're talking about a Gus Malzahn offense, and you're talking about the offense that when he utilized Nick Marshall, all of a sudden now you're looking at a serious college fantasy football asset that you have there at your disposal and available to you in your drafts. And that's why John Rice Plumlee is ranked so high and has the projections that he does, in which we posted on the site, because we did have to project someone in that one spot. And we feel that even though Keene was pretty efficient last year, John Rice Plumlee brings that element of athleticism to the position that Keene doesn't, and can really open up that offense. And you don't necessarily, and history shows that you don't necessarily have to be the greatest passer in that offense. If you've got a quarterback that can threaten with his legs, right? You just need to be able to have your receivers create some separation. And so that's why we're projecting John Rice Plumlee right there. As you mentioned, coming out of the spring, you might feel a little hesitation, but that's what coming out of the spring. Remember, college football is a year-round sport now, right? You've got summer practices, you got preseason practices, and my thought is, and I know you and I kind of land in the same spot on this, given the summer, given the more reps that John Rice Plumlee is going to get back at quarterback throughout the summer, throughout preseason camp, gives him a chance to really get back into the groove. And we're talking about a guy that has a lot of athleticism, and sometimes the curve to get back there is shortened based on the athleticism of the player. So that, this was definitely warranted time to spend here. There's going to be a lot of questions on it, but that's why John Rice Plumlee is rated, ranked, and projected so high. He's a product of that Gus Malzahn offense and what the capabilities are of a quarterback, of John Rice Plumlee's athleticism in that offense, right?
Yeah, I also think it's notable that the incoming freshman they brought in, I'm going to butcher his name, so I'm not even going to bother saying it, but the incoming freshman they brought in, who they also like, another dual threat, right? So it's a stylistic change that I think we're going to see under Malzahn at UCF.
Yeah. Now, look, let's transition to another program where we've got quarterback is a topic of conversation as well, where Desmond Ridder moved on from Cincinnati, Mike. So, a lot coming back at Cincinnati. We did have Johnny Ford move on. We could probably spend some time with Corey Kiner coming in there from LSU, transferring in. But I think really the focus for us is right now at that quarterback spot, where Ben Bryant transferred back to Cincinnati after spending the year and working himself into a starter's role at Eastern Michigan last year against the young gun Evan Prater coming up, right? And so another situation, maybe not as contrast to what we see at Central Florida, but maybe Prater, the younger, more athletic guy, coming in against the more experienced, possibly more efficient Ben Bryant. How are you seeing things shake out? Because I know we have Prater projected right now as our starter, so I know where you're going to land with this. But should we keep an eye on this situation throughout the summer and preseason camp?
I think we keep an eye on it. This is definitely not my personal top question with Cincinnati, just because I think Corey Kiner and who comes out at that running back one is going to be more valuable for CFF purposes. I think it was fairly even coming out of camp between Prater and Ben Bryant, which makes me think that the Cincinnati and their staff have to go with Prater to start the season, right? Ben Bryant's a senior, he's going to graduate after this year. I know he originally signed with Cincinnati, but you don't have any ties to this guy, right? Prater is multiple years left. You have to give him the start, I think, to avoid risking him leaving. Now, if he doesn't win the job and he ends up leaving, well, he wasn't good enough to win the job anyways. But I think you have to at least give him the initial start, in my opinion, see where it goes. And then you have a safety blanket and Ben Bryant.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more. I think in all things considered equal situations, the younger, more talented, the younger guy with maybe the higher ceiling is probably going to get the benefit of the doubt, and nothing, that's definitely ringing more true today than it did maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where guys are ready to bolt out of programs if they're not playing right away, right? Where's Ben Bryant going to go? Well, you lose him. He's a senior. You lose Prater. You possibly are losing a 2, maybe 3-year starter, right? But Mike, let's jump over to the running back with Corey Kiner. If that's a little bit more of the question, let's dig in there for a minute, because this was something before Kiner transferred in. You and I were kind of sitting down and really looking at this running back room saying, oh man, they've got 3 options that they can use there. Well, now Kiner comes in, it's now more of a 4th option, right? And so, we're leaning more with Kiner coming in, the more talented guy, much like Ford came into the program and took over as the starter. But what are some things that might be of concern for you with Kiner?
That Kiner comes in, like I personally think he's going to immediately start. The hesitation, slight hesitation, I would say, is that he comes in just like Jerome Ford did a couple years ago, and he's still splitting time with somebody. Because remember, Jared Doak started for most of that year. We all saw that Jerome Ford was the best talent in that backfield, but you also gotta listen to the coaches and listen to them telling you that Jared Doak was the starter, right? So maybe we see a situation where coaches are saying, hey, it's not going to be Charles McClellan, but maybe a Miles Montgomery, a Ryan Montgomery, maybe coaching quotes lead towards that. I think it's still going to be Kiner. I'm investing in Kiner still in the best balls that we're doing, kind of in the 5, 6, 7th range, just because, if a Cincinnati running back hits, he's going to have 200 plus carries. Kiner already has the size that you kind of look for in a Cincinnati running back, 217 pounds, just kind of Michael Warren-esque, Jerome Ford-esque. And those guys rush for 19 touchdowns, right? So I like Kiner to start immediately, hometown kid. And Cincinnati gets back all 5 starters along the offensive line. They weren't great last year, but again, continuity should help.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that if I were to make a call on this situation, I can see something playing out to what, in a similar fashion of what you mentioned, whether or not Kiner starts out getting the workman's, a great workload and becomes that really workhorse back out of the gate. That's debatable. But I think when you've got Prater and you've got a running back like Kiner, I think what I'm looking at, maybe slow out of the gate, but when they sort of hit their stride, weeks 3, weeks 4, weeks 5, I think that's when we'll see what Cincinnati truly is on offense. And by that time, 3 or 4 games in, when they get into the heart of conference play, then you'll see guys like maybe Prater and Kiner really start to be ridden a little bit more heavily. But I can see some rotation early. But like I said, like you said, and we talk about, we try to look long-term, right? Not necessarily what's going to open up in weeks 1 and week 2, but when you're talking about college fantasy football, you're talking about an investment over the course of the long haul of the season. And so not only do you need the guys productive in the first couple of weeks, you need them for the long haul. And so that's what I think with Cincinnati, they sort of hit their stride in weeks 2, 3, 4. They spend the first couple of games trying to figure that out. Now, one team where we don't have to worry about figuring a lot out is Houston. That returns a lot as well offensively, Mike, but there are some questions there. We know that they lost Alton McCaskill, right? And so what's going to go on with running back there? What's your biggest question for the Cougars going into 2022?
If I had a question or concern, it would be Nathaniel Dell. And I still, obviously, I rank him, I think he's in 11, wide receiver 11, 12. But Dana Holgerson really attacked over the offseason what was the issue last year, right? Who did Houston throw the ball to anytime, Tune was under duress? It was Nathaniel Dell. 32% target share, which is 9th in the country. they had nobody else to throw the ball to, right? It was Dell, and that's about it. So Holgerson went out and fixed that issue. You get Matthew Golden, the high 3-star recruit who obviously popped during the spring game. You get Sam Brown, Joseph Manjack. You get Keyshawn Carter back, Cody Jackson from Oklahoma. So you've got all these bodies now. That target share is not going to be at 32% again this year. I'd have to imagine if one or two of these guys steps up and becomes, a solid option for Clayton Tune in the passing game. So, Nathaniel Dell's still going in that third round range. Is that going to be too high? So if I have a concern about Houston, it would be, my Nathaniel Dell shares, which I have a few of them, but, I'm kind of my hot take, I guess, for this season is that if there is a quarterback that has a Kenny Pickett-like boom season, it's going to be Clayton Tune. The weapons, as I just mentioned, are there for him. Schedule is relatively easy. The AAC schedule plus, I think they get Texas Tech might be their best opponent, non-conference. I don't quote me on that, but I don't think it's anything overbearing. And then Alton McCaskill in the running game, we project Brandon Campbell, but he hasn't proven anything to this point. Tajon Henry's kind of a scat back type. I think it bodes well for Clayton Tune, maybe getting some more red zone touches, improved as a passer last year. I think if there's a quarterback that jumps into the top 10 that we don't project, I think Clayton Tune has a really good shot at that.
We are in complete agreement right there. I know we've spoken about Tune as well, wondering with McCaskill's injury, maybe a change philosophically, throwing the ball a little bit more. If a wide receiver 2 emerges opposite Dell, remember they've got Trahan at tight end as well, right? If they have some options emerge at receiver for Tune, he could be where he's going in drafts right now. Will be he's extremely valuable with where he's going, given the upside of that offense, particularly if they get a little bit more pass heavy, losing McCaskill. The question is, they're going to have backs to fill McCaskill's spot. The question is are they going to be able to get, that type of productivity out of their next running back? And so we might see them take to the air a little bit more. I do like Nathaniel Dell. I do think he's going to be a frequent target. Will he get the share that he got last year? That's arguable, debatable, and maybe not likely. But where you and I are agreeing is that we feel the offense for Houston could be even more better this year and take to the air a little bit more, so that where he might not make up on the percentage, he might make up on just sheer volume of targets. And so, yes, we're in agreement on Clayton Tune right there. Let's skip over to East Carolina, Mike, where, you've got running, the quarterback coming back, Holton Ahlers. There's some turnover at receiver. Where are your eyes kind of glancing in regards to going into the new season with East Carolina right now?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of strong opinions regarding East Carolina. I think they're going to be better this year, not from a fantasy standpoint, but just kind of overall football team. I know the head coach, Mike Houston, kind of went out and upgraded the offensive line, which has been a struggle since he was hired, the defensive line. So I think they'll be better. How much that translates to actual fantasy production, I'm not sure. You didn't really hear a lot about Holton Ahlers this spring, I don't know, kind of same guy, maybe. They mentioned the backup more. So I don't think he's necessarily a threat to get replaced, but you don't hear about these major steps in progression now being a senior. Keaton Mitchell's a really good back, really explosive, but they got Rajay Harris, who we can poo-poo as a average running back, but coaches don't talk about him like that. They talk about him as a 1B option to Keaton Mitchell. Plus, you add Kamaro Edmonds, the North Carolina transfer. So, this is a scheme that doesn't have a 200 carry workhorse, if you look back over the years. So they're going to spread it around, maybe not with 3 names. So, wide receiver core is kind of, they were the beat writers killed the wide receivers during the spring. Nobody stepped up. So I think they'll be a better team, but I don't fantasy production is probably just going to be the same as years past.
I feel like quarterback Holton Ahlers has been one of those guys over the last 3 years where there's just been a lot of optimism, and he's never seemed to kind of give that one breakout season. And so now we're going into his last season like, oh, what we see is what we get. Right now, we know they went and they added Isaiah Winstead, right, at receiver. They brought him over for Toledo. I do think that the receiver situation is worth monitoring because somebody has the possibility of being a target hog in that offense. We just don't have a good beat on it. And I think for me, and this is something that we've discussed when we were doing projections, when you look at Keaton Mitchell and Rajay Harris last year, their rushing totals as in regards to their carry distribution was relatively 50-50. They were pretty darn close. It was Mitchell. His yards per carry average was just astronomical compared to Rajay Harris's. And so that's my concern with Mitchell this year is, are they going to springboard? Is Mitchell going to springboard from last season? Are they going to feature him a little bit more because of that? Or are we going to see a little bit more of a 50-50 share because they feel that Rajay Harris has a little bit more of a bounce back season and we see those rushing totals come a little bit closer together? So for me, that's really the concern with East Carolina, is trying to figure out, where does Keaton Mitchell fit in this? Is he going to be that go-to workhorse back? I don't really see that happening. I can see them divvy up carries a little bit closer to like what they had last year. And when you look at the yards per carry, I don't think Rajay Harris can get much worse. And then all of a sudden, like you said, you throw in Edmonds in there from the UNC transfer. And I'm wondering whether or not Mitchell can kind of hit the numbers that he had last year. So that's where I'm at as well. So anything to move on with East Carolina before we finish up them, Mike?
Yeah, two quick notes. CJ Johnson, we do not have him projected right now, but he's still on the roster. So keep tabs on that during the summer. He's suspended or was suspended during the spring. But again, still on the roster, no movement that we've seen there. So could still be an option for Holton Ahlers in the passing game. And then tight end real quick, Ryan Jones is being drafted in our best balls as a top 15 tight end. Makes sense. He had 20 receptions in the final month, but you see Shane Calhoun, the backup, being listed as the starter actually in a few places. So maybe because the wide receiver room is lacking, that they get the tight ends more involved, but I have not been drafting Ryan Jones.
Yeah, and Shane Calhoun was a name that we noticed was popping out in some of the scrimmages that was being reported on too. So that's a good notice, just sort of throwing out the caution flag for what we've seen from East Carolina since the spring. We're going to go over to another team where I don't think we're going to have a ton of questions, Mike, but it's worth mentioning Tulsa. Where they get Keelan Stokes back. I know you and I were a little surprised when we saw that he was coming back again. They have Juan Carlos Santana coming back. So 2 receivers coming back this year, but they did lose Shamari Brooks at running back this year. So I think for me, it's kind of keeping an eye on the Tulsa backfield and will there be any type of a workhorse back there? Will we see some split carries? What are you looking at Tulsa right now?
Yeah. Did you hear that sound behind me? That's Davis Brin throwing another interception. Okay. He did not pan out last year. He was fine, right? Threw for 3,000 yards, but had 18 touchdowns, 16 interceptions. And you look back at his game log, it's very noticeable. He struggled against good competition and beat up and when I say beat up, it was, 2 touchdown passes. He beat up on lesser competition. So he really struggled outside of throwing for 400 yards against Ohio State in that week 2 game. But, he's just a back of the roster type quarterback because he doesn't run. Running backs, I haven't invested any draft capital there. They've got, Benedict Prince back, Anthony Watkins back.
Yeah.
I just read it. They added some JUCO transfer who rushed for 1,000 yards last year that I didn't even realize was on the roster. So maybe that's a potential, another body in that backfield that gets carries. So not really interested there. They brought back all 5 starters on the offensive line last year, and they weren't even any good. And now they have turnover. So I'm worried about the running game and the offensive line. I think Keelan Stokes is probably who I'm most interested in. Maybe Juan Carlos Santana because he's so explosive. But Yeah, it's kind of receivers and not much else for me with
Yeah,
those.
I agree with you. I think more so Keelan Stokes would be more of a target for me, particularly in PPR formats, maybe half point PPR, but I would think that would be more of the guy that I would be looking at with Tulsa as well. Now, Memphis is a different situation. We've got a bunch of options there. We could go a number of different ways here. I know for you and I, yeah, obviously with Grant Gunnell transferring out of that program kind of makes things easier at quarterback. Seth Hennigan, we were already leaning that way as well when we were doing projections. So, something you and I talk about when we're doing this in April and May, we talk about all the time, man. We wish somebody would transfer or, because, we talk about this. I don't like to wish injuries on anyone, but transfers and injuries create about as much clarity on a depth chart than anything that we could possibly hope for. So when Grant Gunnell, transferred out of there, that was sort of the writing on the wall for Seth Hennigan, right? Well, let's look at the other situation at running back where they bring in Jay Ducker from Northern Illinois, right? And so now that's created a little cloud of uncertainty at the running back position for us going into the new year. You've got offensive coordinator Tim Cramsey that has come in here that historically has been his running back ones have been just fantasy gold most years, right? And so now we've got another clouded situation where, Memphis has a deep backfield. They bring in Jay Ducker. You've got Brandon Thomas coming back. You've got a few names there that have some experience. Is that kind of where your eyes are at right now?
They have experience, but they're not any good.
No, I get it.
And I might even be too harsh on those running backs because
that's what you say about me sometimes, Mike.
Yeah.
You got experience, but you're not any good.
you're the Papa Joe of the group. That's fine. But yeah, I mean, I criticize, a Rodriguez Clark or whatever as just kind of a guy, and Kyle Watkins, some of the guys that they've had in the backfield. But running game hasn't been any good since Ryan Silverfield took over as head coach. I think it was like they're at 180 yards the season before he took over. Then they dropped down to 145 yards per game, and then it bottomed out last year to 136 yards per game. So I don't know if it's scheme, if it's the offensive line. I'd have to dig in a little bit more on that, but the running game just hasn't been any good with this current staff. So maybe Tim Cramsey can help out. Unfortunately, we didn't get any resolution in the spring in terms of a depth chart because Jay Ducker, the NIU transfer, was not available during camp. So we definitely, I think we're in agreement that we project Ducker to win out there. I think Brandon Thomas can kind of challenge him because he looked good in spurts last year, but I think it's just kind of the scheme as a whole needs to be upgraded for Ducker or whoever starts to produce at a level that we've seen from Memphis backs.
I think that's why we sided with Jay Ducker, right? To your point earlier, they've got a number of bodies in there, but none that have been able. And now, don't get me wrong, Ducker did it at NIU, but like NIU, they won the MAC last year, right? So that offense was legit, and he was very good, and he's the only guy that's on the Memphis roster right now that really has shown and has proven that he can do it over the long haul, week in and week out, with the workload that Cramsey likes to get out of his running back ones, right? And so that's why we side with Jay Ducker coming out of the spring. Wouldn't you agree with that point there?
Yeah, and I don't have the timeline in the back of my head, but I would assume Ducker's arrival came after Cramsey. Maybe I have that mixed up, but I would assume they hired Cramsey and they sought after Ducker in the portal. So must be a scheme fit there that Cramsey saw. Real quick to button up Memphis, I think to talk about the receivers a little bit, because you got 146 vacated targets. We're not going to see a Calvin Austin. I think we can all agree there, but you're going to average 32 attempts per game with Memphis and Cramsey, so somebody's going to be viable. I think Javon Ivory's the guy, but I think reports coming out of the spring was kind of a wide receiver by committee. So I take a shot on Ivory, but
which is something that we really were hoping to get coming out of spring, some better reports coming from the receivers. But we saw, especially with Cramsey, as even at Marshall, it was more of a committee approach at times, and there wasn't really anybody that really blew the numbers off there. Where we know Rasheen Ali was just a monster last year, right? And so, I think what we're looking at and what we talked about is we're not going to see a running back produce that type of numbers, but we could expect some receivers to maybe produce a little bit better numbers than what we saw at Marshall last year. And with that being said, you can't ignore Seth Hennigan, right? Let's just not ignore him because last year, Cramsey's quarterback over at Marshall, had a Grant Wells who transferred to Virginia Tech, didn't have a bad year last year. I mean, he threw for a ton of yards last year. So we don't necessarily want to overlook Seth Hennigan, do we?
No, I think he's just like a rock solid, like quarterback 2, quarterback 3 on your roster. Pace, I looked at it, pace and passing volume doesn't change a whole lot with Cramsey versus what the previous offensive coordinator did. Cramsey runs the ball a little bit more, but I mean, it's minuscule difference, like 32 versus 34 pass attempts per game. So volume's not going to change drastically for Hennigan this year.
So moving on from Memphis, I really don't even feel like it's worth time to drop anchor on Navy because we're not going to be there long.
You had that one queued up, didn't you?
Well, when you're talking, I'm thinking of things where I'm going to go next, right? And so that was it. For us, I know we talk about it all the time. It's just whether or not we're going to get those days of the Malcolm Perry quarterbacks, Keenan Reynolds. It seems like those days have come and gone. You've got Ty Lavataille at quarterback. I expect him to be better this year. I expect him to be the starter, but not really much anything. There hasn't been anything relevant, particularly in our best ball drafts or any got by that we've spoken to that have, that are interested in anything in Navy right now. Are you?
No, not at all. I mean, it's been a few years since any position player at Navy's finished within the top 100 last year, or at their specific position. Last year was just a mess. Did you hear about all that stuff with Navy? Like they are obviously struggling. Fired their offensive coordinator. There was uproar because this guy has been with the staff. They've had decade-long continuity with their staff. They fired their OC because their offense was struggling. There was an uproar from the fan base or the team or whomever. The AD ended up bringing he was forced to bring back the offensive coordinator back, but in like a lesser role. And I mean, maybe a slight uptick in offensive production, but not much. So I unfortunately, I'm not really investing much. If anybody, it's Ty Lavataille, just because of the workload that Navy gives their quarterbacks in the running game versus, like Army gives their fullbacks and running backs more opportunities in the running game, their triple option versus Navy. So maybe Ty Lavataille, but that's the extent of it for Navy.
All right, Mike. Well, that ship has sailed. Let's move on to South Florida.
Knew it.
The Bulls added Jerry Bohannon from Baylor out of the transfer portal after Blake Shapen was seemingly the better quarterback over there. Probably an upgrade from Timmy McClain. Jaron Mangum maybe we'll see. Jaron Mangum was spectacular last year. He was a touchdown vulture, right? The question is, can he duplicate that this year? South Florida does have some weapons at receiver. I can see the Bulls being a decent team this year. The question is how much investment can we really make from a fantasy standpoint? And that's where really I'm torn a little bit with South Florida and really kind of on the fence with saying, maybe status quo right now. Maybe the best investment for a South Florida player right now might remain Jaron Mangum in deep formats as some sort of a flex option. Where do you see the Bulls shaking out right now?
Yeah, I think Mangum is obviously the best fantasy option right now. I mean, he rushed for 12, 14 touchdowns last year. I don't remember off the top of my head, but he was tremendous in the red zone. But then you bring over Gary Bohannon, who had 9 rushing touchdowns by himself. I think Mangum's like opportunities in the red zone are bound to regress because Bohannon, if he winds up being the starter, which I'm not so sure about yet, but I think Mangum's numbers could very well regress from the past year. I wanted to talk about the quarterbacks though, just for a little bit. Yeah. We inserted Bohannon as a QB1. I think when you make that kind of addition, I think the coaches view him as a potential starter. But I mean, we drafted Bohannon last year because of that early. Well, I didn't. Kyle Francis drafted him. I didn't draft him. I gave him shit for drafting him, and I ended up being semi-wrong on that. But, we drafted Bohannon for his early season schedule, and he produced, right? He had 4 30-point games against, Texas Southern, let's see, Texas Southern, Kansas, West Virginia, and then Oklahoma, who wasn't any good defensively. But when he got to later in the year, as we saw, hence why we projected Blake Shapen, the wheels kind of came off. He faced more competent defenses and he struggled. On the flip side, you look at Timmy McClain. Now, he wasn't a perfect product by any means last year. True freshman, completed 55% of his passes. His 3 best performances, 70% completion rate against BYU. He had over 300 total yards and 2 touchdowns, led his team to 42 points against Houston, which is very good. And then he killed me on his passing prop against Cincinnati, where I had him under 200 passing yards against that vaunted secondary. And he had a tremendous game. I mean, not tremendous, he threw 2 interceptions, but he kept them competitive. I think he had 2 total touchdowns against the Bearcats. But his 3 best performances were arguably against the 3 best teams that he faced on the schedule, which is drastically different than Bohannon, who struggled against that competition.
Well, it's interesting how the roster is shaping up, and we do have Bohannon projected at quarterback 1. Could this be a situation that we see a little seesawing through the season? Because look at the additions look at what South Florida has at receiver, right? They bring Weaver back. You've got Horn. They bring in Aju from Clemson and Caffrey Brown from North Carolina. So not saying that those guys were any good, because they wouldn't have transferred out of their program if they were playing, right? But the talent's there. And look, that's his 2 decent talent. It's not like those guys went to Navy or Tulane, right? I mean, it's a couple of players that went to some pretty decent programs that have some upside. So it's interesting to see how they're developing the roster there, where they have they've got some decent receivers and some really untapped potential. And then they bring in Bohannon, who has shown he could be productive, particularly put up some fantasy numbers, but is he going to be what the offense is going to need and where they're shaping the roster, right?
Yeah. They brought in 21 new pieces to the roster, but Scott's got to win this year. He's got 1 win against FBS opponent in the last 2 years and 0 wins on the road. It's not good. He needs to start winning games.
Well, talk about another program not good and not many fantasy assets. We can get through Temple real quick, but who gives a hoot, right? Let's see.
For the Owls, right?
For the Owls. That
was an intended joke, wasn't it?
Well, of course it was, Mike. Give me a little bit of credit here. So, one player that you and I have always had fun taking jabs about is Dwan Mathis, where I have been on record telling you this guy's never going to be a full-time starter in the FBS level, right? They bring in Quincy Patterson, was it, from North Dakota State? Is there anything to be excited about with Temple at this point?
No, I don't think so. 45% of their returning production on defense, so they're going to struggle there. There's no fantasy assets at this juncture that we see on offense. Backfield, they brought in a couple of SEC transfers. Iverson Clement is back on the team. He started out at Florida. And then Darvon Hubbard from Texas A&M. So that's SEC, caliber-ish talent coming to the AAC. I'm not gonna propose drafting Dwan Mathis this year, but
please don't.
I won't. I won't. But I will say, I was looking back, the offensive coordinator Danny Langsdorf, when he was back at Nebraska, so you should be familiar as a Cornhusker. I mean, he ran Tommy Armstrong quite a bit, right? So, maybe we're looking, if Dwan Mathis retains his job as the starter, which, I mean, we can have difference of opinion there, but
he might retain it. I'm not saying he's gonna look. I stand to be corrected. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I've just never been wrong on Dwan Mathis since he wore a Georgia uniform.
I'm not saying draft him. I'm just saying running quarterbacks can be valuable in college fantasy. And even their head coach, Stan Drayton, who was at Texas as the assistant head coach, run game coordinator, he's familiar with Sam Ehlinger, who was the starter all 4 years. And he had, 113 carries or more every single year that Ehlinger started there. So, they plan on running their quarterbacks this year, which could potentially be valuable in a weekly matchup, right? Against Navy, for example.
Yeah, let's transition to a team with a little bit more intrigue. Tulane, right? You've got Jim Swoboda coming in there, coming in from Central Missouri to lead the offense. I think Tulane only won 2 games last year. Michael Pratt 2 years ago showed promise. Last year had a really good start out of the gate, but then Tulane kind of hit the blocks in the middle of the season as well, struggled. I think we're going to see some upgrade in offense here with Tulane this year. Where are you kind of, Tajay Spears comes back, should be fully healthy. They have a deep set of receivers, right? So where are you kind of focusing on Tulane right now? What are maybe some questions or some spots that you're hoping to kind of, maybe the wrinkles get ironed out for us?
I think in the passing game is my primary focus, because I do like Michael Pratt. I have a few shares of him in some of my dynasty leagues. I think the noticeable difference between Jim Swoboda and the previous offensive coordinator is with the passing volume. Yeah. I have it written down somewhere. They averaged 28 passing attempts per game under the previous offensive coordinator. That jumps to 35 passing attempts per game under Swoboda. So we should see Tulane throw the ball a little bit more this year. I think you're going to mention Shea Wyatt, who had previous success under this OC. So I won't go into detail there, but they bring back most of their wide receivers from last year. They added a Notre Dame transfer. So the weapons are there for Pratt to succeed. Just got to avoid getting beat up like he did last year, because in that opener against Oklahoma, he took massive shots. So I think keeping him healthy, understanding the offense, if he can grasp it this offseason, I think this passing game can really succeed this year.
Yeah, just to finish up the point of what you started there with receiver Shea Wyatt, and one of the reasons why we're high on him is that he came over from Central Missouri a couple of years ago, and under Swoboda, he had, I think it was a 1,300 yard season at receiver in that offense. And so much of what we see now within college football is when these offensive coordinators go places, sometimes we find success in their players that follow them because their familiarity with the system, right? And so that is one of the reasons why we like Wyatt. There is a deep receiving core there at Tulane. We're not expecting another 12, 13, 1,400 yard season, but there's some things to like with the offense. And like you said, the play calling probably going to be a lot more pass heavy this year. And Wyatt's, being familiar with the system, I think does kind of give him an edge, and why we're higher on him in the projections. And I do like Tajay Spears there. You got to remember, their head coach is still one of those guys that likes to attack through the ground. I don't see them abandoning the ground game. And Tajay Spears, made his return from that knee injury I think he had from a couple of years ago. He should be fully healthy. And I think, Tulane's going to have a well-rounded offense this year, and they're going to be deep.
Yeah, well-rounded. Hopefully some consistency this year from the Tulane offense doesn't cause us to have a wave of emotions.
Oh, look at you! Look at you!
I had to get one.
I like that, Mike. You're playing off. Great compliment to what I'm not finding here. So, look, let's go over and close the AAC out with probably one of the more fantasy rich programs this year for college fantasy football, SMU, right? Where there's options at receiver, options at running back, quarterback. We're projecting Rashee Rice pretty high in that offense. You've got Tanner Mordecai, who comes back. And the question whether or not is Preston Stone going to be a factor in this quarterback race, or is it Mordecai? And then you've got Kamar Wheaton, who came over there, and we're expecting to step into that running back one role after Ulysses Bentley transferred out to Ole Miss. So where do you want to go? There's a few places we could go here, and we can kind of touch on what we're seeing, what we've found, and where some of the best ball drafts are going. But SMU certainly not a program that we want to skim over and we want to spend some time because there's a lot of players on draft boards coming out off of this roster here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can hit on most positions here. I'll start with quarterback. You know, it was it was definitely a battle during the spring, but reading some of the articles, listening to some of the podcasts, it was definitely noteworthy that I think Mordecai solidified his lead towards the end of camp. I was handcuffing at the start. I've kind of gotten away from handcuffing in some of our best balls just because I'm confident that Mordecai can win and keep the job this year. I think the one thing that works in favor of having Mordecai and not, I think the relationship with Lashley and Stone helps here because Lashley recruited Stone out of high school, so they have a good relationship. I believe Stone's from the area, so like probably doesn't want to leave, the Texas area. But I think his relationship with Lashley is good in that even if Mordecai wins the job, plays the whole season, I think Stone will remain at SMU. So you get a full season of Mordecai. If you have Stone on your roster, you get him in dynasties, you get him for next year. So I think Mordecai will will retain the job this year and for the full season. I think, and then the one thing that works in favor of Mordecai with the transition to Lashley's offense, Lashley's going to take more shots deep this year. That's just part of his scheme. And Mordecai did succeed in that area. I think he was, 13 of 23 for 8 touchdowns beyond 20 yards last year. So he was good throwing deeper, which is a part of Lashley's system. So I think it is a fit here.
And we're looking at Kamar Wheaton to step in there. Obviously he didn't get any playing time last year, but we're looking at him coming in with Bentley now out of there and just kind of inserting himself, plugging into that running back one role. As long as he can stay healthy, there's no reason why somebody with his talent can't step in and take over that running back one role, right?
I mean, are you still a Trey Siggers fan?
Well, I tried to tell you last year, man. This was funny. I kept telling you every week, Trey Siggers, and Bentley was just not panning out. And I told you it's a year-to-year thing. I'm not on the Trey Siggers train this year. I'm on the Kamar Wheaton train. It's a different year, Mike. It's a different year, just like I'm going to have different sleepers. And look, it's coming. This is the first conference preview we've done. Changes are a coming for 2022, my man.
Yeah, I mean, Bentley was recruited by an SEC school and Siggers is still at SMU. So I think that kind of shows who's the better running back, maybe, kind of. But on the subject of,
well, here's something too, real quick, before we get off of SMU. I think we're all in agreement. Rashee Rice is definitely it, right? Or where we have probably spent more time in conversation with SMU is trying to figure out, is there going to be some sort of legitimate wide receiver too that emerges as a fantasy factor, right? We had Joshua Moore, who looked like he was going there, not there. Bo Corrales came over from North Carolina. We're really not dead set on a wide receiver two right now being much of a fantasy factor. And right now, I think you and I may both have Corrales a little bit more in that slot right now. Do you still have him right there?
Yeah, just to close the loop real quick on Kamar Wheaton. I like Kamar Wheaton as you do this year. Lashley, when he was at Miami last year, just stressed. He wanted a workhorse. Nobody eventually became a workhorse, right? Knighton's too small. Some other guys had injuries and such, but Lashley is insistent on having a workhorse. And if Kamar Wheaton wins that job, I think it's, wheels up for him. With regards to wide receiver, I know that you're a big proponent of this too. For a team that's going to throw it 400 plus times, somebody else is going to be a viable option in the passing game and relevant in CFF. But I'm not seeing anybody else right this moment other than Rashee Rice. I mean, they brought in 3 transfers. Well, they brought in 3 transfers recently, in addition to bringing in Bo Corrales earlier in the winter. Jordan Curley's still around. Some of those sophomores who we really liked, and Roderick Daniels and Dylan Goffney, are still around. Just a lot of guys. Clearly, if you're bringing in 4-5 transfers, you're not happy with the current construction of your wide receiver room, right? So I'm not touching anybody else beyond Rashee Rice. I'm still not even a huge Rashee Rice fan, but he's got positional flexibility. He's gonna be lined up in the slot. 3 of the last 4 wide receiver ones under Lashley in the slot. So it's Rashee Rice and nobody else for me.
Well, to your point though, that's right now, right? And that's why these, we're doing these shows right now in June. We still have to go through some preseason camps, right? So these are the things that we're going to be watching as we go, because like you were mentioning, this offense, there's a pretty good chance we're going to see a a relevant wide receiver 2 emerge. We're not there yet, but these are things we've got to keep eyes on as we get into preseason camp. Maybe it's not even until we're a couple of weeks into the season and one of these guys become a waiver wire gem, right? And so to your point, that's kind of the point of doing these shows, to see the evolution of where we're at now, where we've come from in the spring, and where we're going to be a couple of months down the line, Mike. So that's really going to do it for the AAC. I know you and I had spoken about doing these. We're going to try to alternate, go G5, P5. Next up's going to be the ACC. So we'll tackle them, and that'll be our next show up. But with everything that we're doing and everything that we're discussing, we're touching upon on the guide, it's all right there. We're going to be updating it. It seems like at this particular point, we're kind of getting some updates in there every 5 to 7 days. So it looks like that guide, the projections are being updated once a week right now. And things tend to get and be a little slower during the summer months, unless we get some transfer news. And then as we get a little bit closer to the end of, after the 4th of July, and once when teams start getting into camp, and once when they start practicing and we get reports, that preseason fantasy draft guide and the projections will just sort of, it remains organic, and it just keeps growing, and we evolve it all the way up until a couple of weeks before the season starts, which is the height of college fantasy football draft season. So Mike, that's it for the AAC, unless you want to put a bow on it, something else that we left off.
I wish I had a pun for SMU right now with the last team we left off on, but I do not. So make sure you sign up, everybody, to the sites. We've updated the guide with depth charts. Who doesn't love depth charts? Always fun to look at. As you said, the guide's constantly evolving. And then again, the Discord is popping. We're getting new subs every day. New people joining, discussing fantasy football daily. So
slowly but surely, everyone's coming over. That Discord is really just invaluable the closer you get into the season and in the season, because all of the late breaking news finds its way in there, from injuries to, any last minute game day news. And then I know for you covering the DFS, a lot of those late breaking player news will even be even more important as we get closer to there. So, the one thing that I say is, the earlier you come in, the benefit you have is to see the evolution of where some players are trending up, down, as you get a little bit closer to your season, as most of the drafts in college fantasy football usually are scheduled sometime between the start of the season and after the 4th of July. So that's going to do it, Mike. We're going to put a bow on the show. The AAC is done. We're time to move on to the ACC. So for Mike Bainbridge, my name's Joe DeSalvo. We'll see you guys on the next conference preview show when we do the ACC.